Well, good evening, everyone. I think we're about ready to get started. So if people want to take seats, please go ahead. A very warm welcome. Thanks, everyone, for being here. For those who don't know me, my name is Stephen Wright, and it's my great honor of serving the University of Toronto as the Interim Dean in the Faculty of Arts and Science. I'm so glad to see so many of you here tonight, and to be co-hosting this event with my colleague, Professor Chris Yip, Dean of U of T's Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering. And I look forward to connecting with you later to find out what life has been like for you beyond U of T. We're really grateful to have this U of T network here on the West Coast, and we really look forward to further engagement. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and welcome other members of the U of T team here today. Deepa Kundur. Deepa is chair of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering in the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering. We have John French here somewhere. John's in the back. John is director of U of T Entrepreneurship. John Cowling. There's John, Business Development Officer with the Arts and Science Internship Program. Mark Rittinger, Executive Director of Advancement and Engineering. There's Mark. Kim Han Rao. Kim is in the back. Executive Director of Advancement and AVP of College Relations with the Faculty of Arts and Science. And we're thrilled to also have Claire Kennedy join us tonight. Claire's in the front here. Claire is one of the Defy Gravity campaign co-chairs, as well as a U of T chemical engineering graduate, among her many contributions to the University of Toronto. I'm really looking forward to our conversation this evening, entitled Taking on Pollution, the Air We Breathe, the Water We Drink. There's no question the planet is facing an environmental and existential crisis right now, and U of T is committed to being a major contributor to finding solutions to these challenges. As one key example, the university's newly launched Lawson Climate Institute will accelerate climate and sustainability solutions that are practical, scalable, and equitable. Our School of the Environment is bringing together perspectives from across disciplines, from the science, social sciences, and humanities perspectives, to address pressing environmental challenges and train a new generation of sustainability leaders. And in a moment, you'll hear from two lead researchers focused on improving the health of two things so crucial to our very survival, our air. You'll hear from Professor Chelsea Rochman, an associate professor in my home department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, who's one of the world's leading experts on plastic pollution. Chelsea is advancing our understanding of how microplastics affect aquatic environments and contaminate food webs. Chelsea has been and is continuing to turn her research into practice through the U of T trash team, which she directs and co-founded. I'll also say she's brought the term trash to Canada in new ways. It's really growing out in Toronto and nationwide. And we'll learn from Marianne Hatzopoulou, Professor of Civil and Mineral Engineering in the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering. Marianne is a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Transportation Decarbonization and Air Quality. She leads the Transportation and Air Quality Research Group, studying the interactions between transportation, air quality, climate change, and public health. We are clearly so grateful and lucky to have these leading researchers here to talk to us today. So with that, please join me in welcoming Chelsea to kick things off.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Well, I think I brought the word trash to Toronto from California. It's really nice to be here. I did all my schooling here. I did my undergrad at UC San Diego, my PhD in a joint program with San Diego State and UC Davis. So it feels nice to be in a room with people from both California and Toronto. And so today I'm going to talk about the issue of plastic pollution, talk a bit about what I think we need to do to solve it, how the work I'm doing is relevant to that, and why I think Toronto is a nice place to lead some of this work. And I'll say also California. I do quite a bit of work here still as well. So many of you are probably familiar with the issue of plastic pollution. It's hard to avoid it in the news. But since I started studying this topic more than 15 years ago, we know so much more now than we used to know. We know that microplastic and large plastic is everywhere. Many of you see it on beaches and streets. It's in freshwater, terrestrial ecosystems, and of course the ocean. But it's become so pervasive that the small stuff, the microplastic, is cycling in the global dust cycle, it's cycling in the water cycle, and it's moving through food webs. And today we finally have started to understand thresholds for risk, and at least for wildlife, we understand now that concentrations of the big plastic bags, bottles, and microplastics have crossed these thresholds for risk. And that actually includes right here in the San Francisco Bay, as well as just in the water offshore in Toronto and Lake Ontario. It's certainly time to act, and there is no time to waste, pun intended. And luckily, governments around the world are starting to do so. So city level, federal level, and provincial and state, as well as right now, the first ever international agreement on plastic pollution is being negotiated at the United Nations. Right now, they're arguing about which of these three bins is the best solution. Reduction being reducing plastic waste, which can equal bans on single-use items or creating a circular economy. Increasing waste management, actually collection and containment. And cleanup, which we don't want to need, but right now we do need. These are great, and we absolutely need all three of them, and we need to pull on all three of these levels incredibly hard. But I would argue that we also need three other pillars if we want these solutions to actually work and if we want to see success all over the world. So I'll go through all of these three pillars, talk a bit about some of the work that we're doing and how I think we can scale these up basically for global solutions. So the first one is monitoring and assessing risk. As they try to create these solutions at a city scale, at the global scale, there's not a lot of talk right now about monitoring and risk assessment in terms of understanding our baseline, where is our starting point, using that information to inform quantitative targets for reduction, and also using that information to understand all the sources of plastic coming into the city. So we absolutely need to monitor. And we need to pair those with assessments for risk. So we've created emissions inventory strategies very similar to the way we do for climate change, where you create emissions inventories of greenhouse gases, but for plastic pollution. We've been developing monitoring protocols for sampling and lab analysis, actually helped standardize the first ever analysis for that, and that's here in the state of California, and bringing that to the Great Lakes. And pairing it with risk assessment to know how much is too much is what we're doing, actually helping protect wildlife, having a risk assessment backed by science, but informing local policy in a local framework. So this we're trying to scale up and basically move around the world with local governments. In addition, we need to have scientific working groups to make sure that what we're doing is at the cutting edge of what we understand. We need to better understand ecological impacts to human health. I was having a conversation with someone earlier. We don't know as much about human health as we should, as well as improving methods for quantifying microplastics to get to that smaller stuff, those smaller particles that Marianne will probably talk about. We're not very good at analyzing those, at least for microplastic and nanoplastic, and understanding mitigation. So this is a video of a project I'm leading at the Experimental Lakes area in northwestern Ontario on microplastics to basically use an ecosystem scale experiment to try to understand some of these effects, improve our methods, and test remediation strategies. And finally, we need to translate our science outside of the lab. We need groups basically working on the ground. If we have an international agreement, a federal agreement, whatever it is, we need boots on the ground understanding what are the sources, which we can do through cleanup, taking that information to test and pilot solutions so that we can scale them up, and educating the public. If we don't increase awareness, it's going to be hard to have people on board making sure that those solutions actually work. So really my goal is to take all of these three pillars, try to scale them up around the world so that we have this global solution. And I think Toronto is a really great place to be right now to be doing this work. For those of you that aren't in Canada anymore and maybe not following, we do have some of the most comprehensive plastic policy right now federally that has been introduced. U of T, as you probably know, is among the most sustainable universities in the world. And right now, our MP, my local member of parliament, is our Minister of the Environment, and she created a lot of that plastic policy. So we have an opportunity to work locally to really push some of these policies into place and bring them out into the world globally. So I'd be happy to answer more questions about that later. Thank you. And I'm going to pass it over to you or to Marianne.
I'm supposed to thank Chelsea and then pass it on to Marianne to pick things up. Thanks a lot, Chelsea.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'll be talking about another emerging pollutant, just as small as microplastic, right? And we're going to be talking about air pollution and specifically about ultrafine particles. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what ultrafine particles are. So everyone is familiar with the concept of air pollution and dust, right? Aerosols in the air. Ultrafine particles are these species of particles that are tiny, tiny nanoscale particles. They are so small that they don't stop at the nose level. They don't even stop at the lung level. They're able to actually penetrate into your bloodstream and interact at the intracellular level. So there's been a lot of interest in how ultrafine particles affect our environment, affect our health, and their main source is combustion, right? Primarily transportation. Large urban areas, it's cars, it's trucks, it's airplanes, marine transportation, rail, really big sources of ultrafine particles. Now, I've been doing this kind of research for a while. It's been about 15 years that I've been doing it. And I would say the biggest game changer in our ability to understand ultrafine particles, or UFPs, is technology, right? We now have the technology that allows us to measure them, to characterize them, to understand how they move around the urban area, how they're generated. A little bit of my research, back in 2010, a lot of the work that I was doing was equipping people with a UFP instrument. People would carry it in their backpacks, in their lunchbox, or on bicycles. And as long as you're carrying it with you, I can really tell you what you're exposed to. I did a lot of research on trying to pair these devices with other measures of physiology, looking at blood pressure, looking at people wearing Holter monitors, looking at cardiovascular effects of ultrafine particles. Now you fast forward to 2025, 15 years later, what we're doing right now is, and again, because of that technology enabler, because of the massive advances in AI, we no longer have to have a monitor on you to tell you what you're exposed to. We can put these monitors on vehicles. We can have cameras on the rooftops, so like a Google Street View, but also paired with air pollution sensors and UFP sensors. And then we can leverage all these data from images to develop models that predict what UFPs look like. So the idea of, give me a picture of your neighborhood and I'll tell you what air pollution looks like, right? And so that allows us to no longer do measurements everywhere, but be able to still predict and understand everywhere. Now, this is what I call the idea of low-tech, low-cost, high intelligence. And I say now that we are in the era of, we want to focus on very low-cost technology, but your ultrafine measurement is as good as the intelligence that you build around it, right? So instead of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on instrumentation, we actually spend that fraction of the cost on instrumentation and build this as intelligence. Images tell us everything we need to know about a street corner, the height of the building, the presence of the trees, the number of cars on the road, number of trucks that are circulating. We can derive so much information. And by mining these images and pairing them with some measurements, we can create these maps, which I call exposure surfaces. For those of you who are familiar with Toronto, this is sort of the city of Toronto, and we can predict ultrafine particles everywhere. So what does that mean? So what do we do with that? What can we do with these predictions? Well, the first thing we could do is we can better understand health outcomes, right? And again, I take you back to some of my early publications in that space working with epidemiologists, and that was in 2014, we had a paper where I called it the women's study, where we actually had women cyclists carry ultrafine particle monitors with them, undergoing fairly rigorous bike rides in the city, but we were also measuring all sorts of other cardiovascular outcomes. And we actually did observe meaningful, measurable changes in heart rate, in blood pressure, in heart rate variability as a result of breathing ultrafine particles. Again, if you're a healthy human being, I mean, these are women cyclists who are used to cycling, you won't feel it. But our monitors are already telling us what's going on. So if you are compromised, you are diabetic, you are asthmatic, you are somebody who is obese, then you will be experiencing some of these symptoms. We've done a lot of research also in the space of preterm birth and looking at women across different stages, of conception to better understand the implications of ultrafine particles and air pollution on birth outcomes. Again, fast forward to 2024. Back then, we were doing a lot of research trying to understand the cardiovascular system. Now we're looking at brain. These particles are so small that there is toxicological evidence that they cross the blood-brain barrier, right? So we're looking at now, we're able to identify increased risk of brain cancer incidence or dementia or Alzheimer, various aging diseases as well associated with that. Now, beyond that, so we're looking at health, we're looking at exposure. I've been very interested in the space of justice and equality. Do we all breathe the same air? We actually don't. Even if we live in the same city, we don't all breathe the same air. Air pollution, especially ultrafines, have massive spatial variability. You could be living in an area that is called a hot spot, and you move in a couple of blocks and you live in an area that is very, very clean. Well, guess who is exposed to these hot spots? Turns out that there are very strong correlations with social disadvantage. So we looked at neighborhoods that rank really high on the social disadvantage scale. So we're talking about indices of material deprivation, residential instability, dependence, ethnicity, and pretty much 60% of the neighborhoods that score high on social disadvantage are also the neighborhoods that score high on ultrafine particle concentrations. What's more, I'm adding here another burden, which is the idea of thermal discomfort. This was a study where we actually also measured temperatures. So we flooded Toronto. We had 200 temperature sensors across the entire city to try and understand these very local temperatures over summers that were very hot. And guess what? We don't all experience the same heat as well, right? And it turns out that those neighborhoods that score high on social disadvantage are experiencing all of these other burdens, and that's the idea we call the triple burden, right? So what else can we do, right? How can we take this to action? How can we move this? We're doing a lot of progress, developing these models, building AI around these models that can do these great predictions. How do we nudge action? One way in which we nudge action is campus community partnerships, right? Is working with neighborhoods, lived experience experts. I tell a lot of people, if you breathe it, it's there, right? You don't breathe ultrafines, you breathe other things that are correlated to them, right? So how can we leverage that? And we've been doing a lot of citizen science approaches. This is an example of the Bathurst Quay neighborhood, and that's a neighborhood that is right across from Billy Bishop Airport, which is a regional airport in downtown Toronto. Airports are massive sources of ultrafine. And I have colleagues who have done big studies in LAX and CTAG, and some of these massive airports are really huge generators of ultrafine particles. So again, trying to arm and equip communities with the data and the science that allows them to actually participate in really healthy debates and discourses. When the city of Toronto is trying to negotiate, the expansion of the airport, when policymakers are looking at, rolling out new policies and regulation, communities can go a long way when they have that kind of evidence. Now, why U of T? We truly have a critical mass of researchers doing research in air pollution, but also linking that to epidemiology. And for those who are not familiar with that space, Canada is very, very uniquely positioned because Canada has health-based cohorts that exist nowhere else in the world. The Canadian government had invested quite a bit in developing these really large health-based cohort that allow us to do this kind of research. And we've been doing a lot of work within that space. Some of the work that I've been doing is on trying to find solutions. I've done a lot of work on electrification. And again, I don't want to be just strictly promoting electric vehicles because I don't want to be promoting, automobility. But we've done studies where we're looking at, what are the co-benefits of electrifying our vehicle fleet for air pollution? And guess what? We quantified that every time you buy an electric vehicle, you're saving society $10,000 in health costs from associated with exacerbation of asthma outcomes, emergency hospital visits of childhood asthma. It's not money in anyone's pocket, but ultimately we're all paying, right, for these health costs. And looking a lot at, I've been talking a lot with public transit agencies whenever they're trying to justify, buying electric buses, and they're doing all of these carbon calculations that it doesn't add up. And I always say, if you're looking for the big billions of dollars, health is there, right? And you have to not forget about all of the air pollutants, all of the other species that are generated by exhaust. I have a lot of colleagues working in the space of indoor air quality. How do we actually protect our indoor environments and make them cleaner? We've been looking a lot with Greg Evans on what we call non-exhaust air pollution. So anything that is associated with brake wear and tire wear, and working with manufacturers, how do we better design brake pads, right? Especially with electric vehicles, because they are heavier, there is greater evidence that the tire wear might be higher, right, as the rubber hits the road. And with Sarah Haynes looking again at housing, how do we build quality housing that also ensures that spaces, indoor spaces, are safe, are healthy, are free of air pollution. So I think with this, I'm going to end my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. I think it's my turn to invite both our speakers up to the front, take a position on the stage. You guys want water? Huh? No, we're good. You're good? Okay. So first off, thank you, Chelsea and Marianne, for wonderful talks. Very provocative, very informative. I keep thinking, Marianne knows I'm going to go down this path. If there's anyone in the audience that works for an automotive manufacturer, we had this great idea that from a citizen science perspective, you could buy the option that your car could be the sensor system, right? Add it to the front, drive around, you do a citizen scientist, your car's already collecting all the video data anyways, anonymize it. No one here from any of the, anyways, we'll put it out there. Maybe we'll talk to Waymo and get them to add it to their system. So, because I thought this was a great idea. We were actually talking to a couple people. Anyways, you've gotten everyone off to a great start thinking about pollution instead of that such a great perspective. I do get the chance to ask a few questions, and so I'm gonna start that first before I invite people up to the mic. And so, I think, and also given a little bit about the context of what we were just in a different session, which is really about how does this move and translate into reduction to practice and practical opportunities. So maybe I'll start with Marianne first. How do you see taking the insights you had here? I'm actually glad you brought in a few other faculty members because you can kind of look at it and also look at it from the perspective of a chair of a department. How do you see taking this research and rolling it out in kind of a a practical context and taking that data?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I mean, practical context can be two elements, right? It could be policy, planning, regulation. It can also be entrepreneurship, right, and commercialization. I think I'll start with the commercialization, and there's a lot of things that are ready. I haven't been very interested in rolling them out, but there's a lot of things that are ready, and so, like just putting it out there, right? Again, the idea that, images can really provide so much information about pollution in our environments. We're looking at soundscapes as well. So just measuring noise, because it's a lot cheaper to actually measure noise than measure air pollution. But a soundscape of the city also tells you a lot of things about the trucks that are passing by, the speed at which they're passing by, the number of cars, and trying to actually predict air pollution from these kind of soundscapes of the city. So there's a lot of technology out there, and I think that's where we really need to put a lot of effort, is create really cheap technology. And it is not unreasonable to think that massive thing on the urban scanner, I mean, this is our research vehicle, it could become the size of a shoebox, right? It could be something that OEMs can install on these vehicles, and vehicles can become better sensors of our environment, right? I think the challenge in this case is we're measuring pollution. We're not, what's the business case, right? And I think that has always been the challenge. Who's gonna buy that? Why would anyone want to buy a vehicle that can measure air pollution for the greater good? And how do we find a business case to leverage that? Yeah.
I think it's an interesting perspective. We talked a little bit from the sort of personal, do I want glossy paint? Do I want rims on my car? Or do I want to do citizen science and be part of a global experiment, right? Because I think this is the context. You have manufacturers which sell cars around the world. And you could look at just go into China, right? And it's all EV now, but you sort of say, well, I've got a huge population base and I could do this measurement. So again, I do put that idea out to anyone in the room who's into miniaturization, systems engineering, and so on. Chelsea, same question. More from, I guess, a policy perspective, you talked about the UN trying to identify which of the 3 categories how do you see that playing out across the globe?
I guess to that, can I answer the first question?
Oh yeah, no, go ahead.
liked
Do you
your
have a corporate,
question.
well,
Look, I could
startup
do.
ideas going on right here?
Well, I think in terms of how we get the research out into the field, I think that the UN will choose how to deal with these 3 things. And I think then there will be these national action plans where citizens and different communities are going to have to figure out how to act. So I'd say I'll pull an example from the U of T trash team. So we hire students every summer, basically, that we have trash traps on the waterfront in Toronto. And those trash traps are basically machines that clean up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And our students are hired. We hire 5 of them. So there's 2 students out there every day. They empty the trash traps and they quantify and characterize what's in them. And that's cleanup, but it's also monitoring. And so then we can look at that data and basically see what are the sources coming into the city. So one example that actually surprised me recently is we were finding a lot of styrofoam in our traps, and it did not look like foodware, and it did not look like shipping materials. So we were like, what is this styrofoam coming from? So we hire students to do these really applied research projects. And the first student basically had an inkling with a government colleague that it was construction foam. So she figured out basically what construction foam looked like, and she used an XRF, a machine basically to ping it and see whether it had bromines, the flame retardants. And she found that 50% of the foam we were seeing was indeed from construction. So then we hired another student the next year, and we basically said, we want you to go to construction sites around Toronto, there are many, and lay out transects and count the amount of litter basically leaking from the construction sites. And in doing that, then the workers are like, what are you doing? I want to learn more. So we'd interview them and learn, like, what do you know about this issue, and how do you think about it in your industry? So we quantified that, and then we started talking to them about solutions. And then the next student who was hired piloted those solutions, and now we're trying to create these best management practices. So basically, we use our data to work with communities in the city, industry, government, whoever it is, basically to pilot those solutions. And I think for your cars, the government could mandate that type of thing, where then they make a car with the sensor, and then when I buy it, I pick my paint, but that's just on there.
There you go. It's not about, I mean, think you mandated catalytic converters, right? When you switched over, right? You mandated seat belts, right? You mandate a bunch of things. And I think from the perspective of, as an engineering challenge, I mean, miniaturization, low cost, constant monitoring, your cars have a lot of this already built into them, right? I don't doubt that you could get video systems and just pull the data. You anonymize it, of course. Yeah. We did talk a lot about, working with Canada Post, although that may not be a good solution given Canada Post's current business context in Canada. But we'll go with FedEx, we'll go with UPS, we'll go with those folks. And it's something that is something where you have a known path, and I think it's interesting. I'm going to go a little bit off script. One of the things, as I'm known to do, one of the things you talked a little bit about was the ultrafine particles. You talked about kind of the local community effect. I will say I did volunteer in my house to put one of the temperature sensors up. How do you reconcile the global context? And I'm thinking about ultrafine particles. You think about the wildfires, you think about that, but 2 questions. One, accumulation, because these don't clear out of your system, right? When you bring them in, sort of think about fish, picking up this and you eat the fish, it bioaccumulates. Inhalation, it'll bioaccumulate as well. But what about the global context? Something that's happening somewhere else in the world, are we starting to see those particles? Can you trace the lineage of those particles into your local system? Is that something that's you're starting to see as well? Or can we, and the same with the brominated microplastic? Sort of how far is that coming into this? How does it get to the lake? Where is the source? Is that the construction site that's right by the lake, or is actually, in fact, that came from a construction site which was actually way up the watershed and it came down? So I don't know, to both of you.
Yeah, I mean, the air pollution knows no boundaries,
Right.
so for sure. And we can characterize aged particles from fresh and brand new particles. We could certainly do that. The ultrafines are by default fresh particles, because as soon as they start moving outside of the city, they become larger particles. So their biggest effect is when you're breathing them and they're just freshly emitted,
Right.
which is what happens, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that this is a question everyone wants to know for microplastics is where did it come from? So it's hard to say, like, for example, when we did monitoring in the San Francisco Bay, we were able to understand some of the most important sources of the plastic, basically washing off from stormwater or coming in from wastewater treatment plants, in terms of most of it was microfibers coming from washing machines, from our clothing, and tire wear particles, tire dust. But we can't tell, this comes from this car on this highway,
Right.
or this has been in the environment for this amount of years, for example. We know that they are moving through food webs. They're in the system for a while, but so we can look at the microplastic and understand the type of material, the color, the shape, and know, okay, this must have come from clothing or whatever it is. But to understand, where it came from,
Yeah, I think one of the questions
people would
is,
like to know.
yeah, I mean, one of the challenges now is, I understand, it's like there's nowhere on Earth that is devoid now of microplastics. You could go to Antarctica, you could go anywhere, and they're there, right? They're pervasive. They're in us now. Everybody's got them in the system. So I think what you raised in some of your papers really points out the fundamental challenge, right? This is now moving into sort of the biomedical space. Are there clearance? Can you get it out? Probably not.
No.
How do you deal with it from it's chronic exposure, right? And is it leading to larger instances of different diseases? So, so I'm interested in what's next, more from a research perspective, right? You talked a lot about moving into kind of the policy space. What from an experimental perspective, what's left? You talked about soundscapes, which I thought was actually kind of interesting. I hadn't thought about that one, but.
Yeah, I mean, where the research is moving for ultrafines right now, first of all, we don't have standards yet. These are not regulated. That's why we call them emerging contaminants, because there's no standards. EPA was at some point getting close to the idea of establishing standards. Europe has some sort of a standards. World Health Organization has a guideline. And the reason why there are no standards yet is for regulators to impose a standard, they need enough evidence of causation of health effects to be able to set up these standards. So I think that's where a lot of the work that we're doing right now is just really supporting the development of robust regulation, and at some point saying, like, how many more of these studies do we need to do, right? It's kind of like with smoking, like, how many more studies you have to do before you say this is not good for you, and we have to regulate that. Yeah.
Chelsea.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because I think there were no standards, and we're finally getting there. And it was a question of we need to have enough on human health effects. So I co-chaired a working group in Southern California at the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, which is a mouthful, or SQURP. And the government basically in California said, we need to know how much is in drinking water. You need to have methods to monitor, and you have to know how much is too much. And because we didn't have standards in order to come up, to have these standardized methods, because we didn't yet know how much was too much. And we also had to do it for the environment. For human health, we don't have enough data. So we fell down. We created methods and standardized them, but we don't know how much is too much. But the reason I think we're able to come up with these standardized methods is because for the ecosystem, we finally could say how much is too much. There had been decade plus of toxicity data that we could pull together and model and try to figure that out. And so it is really unfortunate. Well, I don't know if it's unfortunate, but I mean, it does kind of take that burden of proof in the question of how much data do you need to have. And for ultrafine, they're much small. Microplastics a bit easier to measure than the really small stuff. So
That's great. I think one thing which is cool about, and you sort of emphasize this for U of T, is that you've got folks in engineering doing this work. You're linking to people in public health. You're linking to the policy space. You're also linking to the economic business case. Yes. And you have that expertise. You have this within so many institutions or institutes within the University of Toronto, and you start to leverage in not just the research, but also the undergraduates' engagement, right? Mm-hmm. And you sort of get students like, well, I'm really interested in this from the scientific perspective, but wait a sec, I'm starting to hear the policy angle. I'm going to take my science background, I'm going to roll myself into a graduate degree in the policy space, or I'm going to do an engineering a public policy certificate, because I realize it's just so important that I take that technical insight and I bring it to the regulatory table, and I'm able to have that conversation. So I think this, one of the powerful parts about being at the University of Toronto is you have all that giant web of stuff that we can work together. Fascinating conversation. It's a huge opportunity for me to get to ask cool questions and think of startup ideas. But I'm going to turn it to the audience and see if anyone's got questions. Come up to the mic. I may volunteer people, but if you have questions, yeah, come on, right, go to the mic if you want. Yeah, that one right there.
Thank you both for fascinating presentations this evening. I have a question to Marianne. When we're talking about ultrafine particles and crossing the blood-brain barrier, what are some of the known unknowns that were discovered and some of the unknown unknowns in your research? Thank you.
I think what's known is there has been studies of brain images where these particles were found in the brain. So they're there, they've been found. There are big epidemiological studies. One of those were the papers that I presented that have established very strong associations. What's unknown yet is, well, that causation and the real toxicology, right? With air pollution, there's always kind of this parallel between the epidemiology and the toxicology. The epidemiology is the study of the big population level. We draw these big associations at the levels of millions of individuals. Do you believe them? Yeah, for sure, right? I definitely believe them. But then you need the toxicology, whereby they're actually looking at the mechanisms that are causing certain effects, and that's the piece that's still lacking.
Actually, I think this is too bad to hear. Just walked in, probably grab a drink. But this actually gets into sort of the basic biomedical engineering side of space. Like, can you make a model organoid of a brain and then expose it to somehow, I don't know, freshly prepared ultrafine particles that you can then expose and watch uptake crossing the model blood-brain barrier? These are classic drug delivery type questions and very challenging to study from that context. But this is actually a case where you'd say, like, let's find the people in doing drug delivery systems and using model systems to treat Alzheimer's and neurological diseases. Let's go and work with the environmental scientists who are making the particles, and let's do the exact same experiment. They do this with smoking and lung cancer or model lungs. Same sort of stuff, right? So there's huge opportunity in that particular space. Other questions? Amin. I will call it a name of someone in the room right now.
For these ultrafine particle studies, what constitutes a good negative control group?
What?
I guess a lot of places are polluted. So how do you define a negative control group?
Yeah, well, a lot of the times with these epi studies, it's not, especially with ultrafine, it's not as much case control as much as it is following people over time and for the same individual looking at the fluctuation in their exposure. And mind you, like I said, we've only been able to measure them for the past, robustly maybe for the past 10 years. So a lot of the work that we're doing is backcasting exposures. So predicting exposures in 1995, because we do have these big cohorts of people, especially in Canada. You have tax records and medical records and every single doctor's visit to be able to build these really large models. Yeah.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, and experimentally, I mean, one thing that, Chris, you're talking about exposures, and animal models. U of T does. The Dalai Lama School of Public Health has actually an exposure chamber at the Gage Institute where you can expose people, individuals. Obviously, it's gone through all sorts of ethics approvals. It's fine with consent, but actually doing these kind of human studies as well. Yeah.
I have someone standing by a spinning tire. I don't know. Go ahead. Yeah.
I have two questions. So the first question is, we've heard a lot about microplastics in the oceans and stuff like that. It's in the news all the time. What about the Great Lakes? How do they compare? Are they worse or better, or what? Where are they compared to the oceans?
That's a great question. So when I started my work, I was in the garbage patches, like 1,000 kilometers out to sea, actually off the coast of California. And we were finding microplastics. I'm going to tell the story through fish, in 1 in 11 fish, and maybe a few particles. And then during my postdoc, I was sampling off the coast of like basically Half Moon Bay. I would go and buy from the fishermen, and I would also do the same thing in Indonesia. And I'd find plastic in maybe 1 in 4 fish, a few pieces. And I got to Toronto, and I was asked by the Ministry of the Environment, can we give you some of our sport fish? Can you count microplastics? Hundreds of pieces. And so microplastic in every fish that I looked at, hundreds of pieces. One fish had over 1,000. And then we also started looking in the muscle of the fish, and that's where we also started seeing, like we were talking about blood-brain barrier, we see microplastics move from the fillet or from the gut into the fillet or the muscle. So the Great Lakes are much more contaminated. They're a closed system, relatively, and they're surrounded by big cities. So this sounds weird, but the Great Lakes are a great ecosystem to work in terms of the contamination, to ask and understand questions, because they are so much more contaminated than our oceans. But that's also not a great thing, because it's pretty easy to fall in love with the Great Lakes. So I spend a lot of time working there, and I try to take what I learn here and move it up to the Great Lakes through the International Joint Commission. So it's great question. Yeah, they have a lot.
That's a real revelation, really, in a way. That the Great Lakes are way worse than the oceans. I would have thought they would be cleaner and better.
Why?
I don't know. I just get the impression their lake is fresh water. It's clean. You know, you go around San Francisco Bay here, it's all dirty, and you know, I go up to Lake Ontario or Georgian Bay. It's all clean. You can see through it and everything. And
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Still come.
my second question has to do with microparticles, and that is, I get the impression that the microparticles are concentrated in areas of high density, because those are usually lower cost living areas and stuff like that. Right now, there's a big push, certainly here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Oh, you want to make the density higher and higher and higher. You don't want to have urban sprawl, but maybe urban sprawl is not so bad, because you get a dispersion of all this stuff, and people are not exposed to all these.
That's a fantastic question. That is absolutely a massive dilemma. As we push to densify our cities and our inner city cores, and sure enough, we want to do that because we want, walkable streets and bikeable streets, and we want, all of these diverse, dense environments. If we do nothing to control air pollution, all we're doing is bringing more people closer to the sources of pollution and creating environments that are more conducive to trapping air pollution, right? Through urban canyons, through a lot of that urban canopy. Absolutely. The solution is not, and sure enough, suburbs have lower air pollution, right? But the air pollution of the people who live in the suburbs and drive into the city is what actually is polluting the city. So there is also an inequity there. But the solution is we really need to treat the pollution at the source, right? Make sure that we reduce emissions. Right? Densification is important if we want to be able to get cars off the road, and we want to do that. But densifying without getting cars off the road, then we've done nothing. Yeah.
Great. Any other?
Thank you. Great discussion. A question, picking up on what you were saying about the microplastics and where we are gathering data and the move towards some sort of standards and regulations. My understanding is the San Francisco POC, for example, does not test for microplastics in its water supply. But the State Water Board is developing regulations that may come out next spring. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, and even if they come out with some sort of standard, are there technologies available to treat water down to nano-sized particles? And until that happens, what do you think we can do individually, both to mitigate our own contribution to the plastic problem and also mitigate our exposure ourselves personally to consumption of them, if that's possible at all? And I guess same sort of question with the ultrafine particles, if you have any recommendations along those lines too. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Several, so I'm going to try to remember the trajectory. But yeah, so the State Water Board basically was mandated through this legislation to figure out how to start monitoring microplastics in drinking water and to have that number mean something through some sort of threshold for risk. Because we couldn't define thresholds for risk for human health, the industries really weren't excited to start regularly monitoring. So we developed methods for them to do it. They've been standardized in the state of California. But where we landed is we agreed for some of them to pilot these methods. So some of the agencies across the state are starting to measure. And I should mention, Bob Andrews in civil engineering at U of T is also one of the people developing these methods for drinking water. So it's funny that I think that's my fault because I brought him there. So based on, I guess, how the industries find it in terms of the ease or the burden of starting to measure it, they will roll it out. And the State Water Board, you're right, will decide whether to mandate it. And hopefully we can get to risk assessments. Your question about technology, I thought you were going to ask, do we have the technology to measure it? And the answer is yes, but they have to buy it. It's not cheap. Do we have the technology to fix it? I mean, I think that if you have water that goes through reverse osmosis treatment, it will get those microplastics out. They generally only do that in certain things, like I think in Orange County where they have recycled water. I know in San Diego they tried to call it toilet to tap. That didn't work well, but basically when they recycle the water, then they'll tend to use those filters and that's better. But a lot of times the microplastic is getting in there as it's moving through the pipe systems. So you can, in your own house, if you have an RO filter on your water supply, you can get that out. That's probably the best way to reduce your intake from drinking water. Similar to what I think Marianne said, is the solution is to stop it at the source. And I think that hopefully with this monitoring that's happening in the environment in California and in the Great Lakes and beyond, helps us understand the sources and we start to turn off the tap. So in our Great Lakes experiment, or our experimental lakes experiment, we find that when you turn off the tap or you stop the input of microplastics into a system, in the water column, it goes away. It pretty quickly sinks to the bottom, washes up on shorelines. The question is, how long does it take to bury into the sediments where it's no longer available to organisms? But in terms of from a drinking water perspective, it will help the problem. So we need to prevent it, and until we do, we need to measure it, and you can put an RO filter on your water. For air, I think it's a little bit more difficult.
Everyone's running to Home Depot now to get an RO system for their house.
It is more difficult. They are so small. Even like your regular COVID mask is not going to protect you. But you're raising, this big question of, personal choice versus systematic policy regulation, right? And when it comes to air pollution, I always say it should not be about personal choices. The onus is not on you to protect yourself, right? The onus is on policy that is going to encourage and nudge the right choices. A lot of people who drive really old and polluting cars don't do that by choice, right? They are trapped, they are captive, right? And a big part of the pollution and the big source of ultrafine particles in cities is freight transportation, right? The Amazons of the world and the Walmarts of the world and the Loblaws of the world, if we want to be Canadian, those big, massive diesel fleets that definitely need to renew. And I know California has gone to great lengths to kind of impose emission standards, but we need to do a lot better, right? Especially because these kind of places generate, this environmental justice that I was talking about, right? People living near very large freight distribution centers and warehouses.
Large challenges that we all go and look at our Amazon accounts and figure out when the last time you ordered stuff to your house, thinking about the pollution that's coming from that process. Any other questions for our speakers? Yeah, sure.
Hi, this is Mark Wright. I'm 87 EE. So I'm going to build on that complex thread here, but I'm going to start with a question. We were talking about microplastics as if, well, maybe they are, as a, as a single thing. But do we know the chemical composition of them, and are they different?
They're very different. So I think when I think of microplastics, well, and I guess this is particles, there's really not a huge separation between what we do, but sort of. It's almost a new chemical class of their own, or contaminant class of their own. So we do, for example, if I take a water sample and I extract the microplastics out of it, then the next step is to figure out how many there are and whether they're plastic. So for that, we use Raman or FTIR spectroscopy. That gives you the many, many different types of polymers that they're made out of, sometimes the additive mixtures that are in there. So basically, when you think about microplastics, yes, it's a mixture of different types of particles of different shapes, different sizes that range from the nanometer scale all the way up to the millimeter, 5 millimeter scale is the way they've defined it. And they very, very much vary. So the methods have to take into consideration this broad sweep. The good news about that is that if there are some that are more harmful than others, you can also change materials in order to improve the problem.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
And the bad news is they're all bad for you. No matter.
So the next set, actually, I'd appreciate at the end if there was some contact on how we can further some of this discussion or contact. And to some of that, I just want to throw some things out. So there's a tool by a company called Dassault, it's a French company that's called Biovia Pipeline Pilot. And I bring this up because I've used it in a company to do CNN for large molecule medical research. But you can also do toxicology research with that. So based on your answer that the microplastics are different, and we also know the chemical composition, there's a possibility to use CNN AI with Biovia to kind of see these toxicology effects, which then can be taken to the government areas and further some of the things. Second on that, I've read recently, I don't know too much detail, but I think EU is working on putting filters, and I think France adopted it in 2025 on washing machines, right? So again, more data, and there's things we can do. And finally, on your idea for the cars, I think car manufacturers are really, they're trying to drive, dollars out of the cars. But if you step back and you look at people, look at the audience here, we all came here because this is a very interesting topic to us. And then you look at efforts like SETI. And in the Bay Area, there's a company called Purple Air. And these are companies that will sell sensors, and then you have this distributed knowledge base, right? And business models can be built up from that. And that's something I'm interested in as well. And so, yeah, I'd like to get involved more. I wanted to pass that out. Thank you.
Can I say one thing on the washing machine filter since you brought it up and we're sitting in the state of California? So there was a bill that was passed in the state of California. It passed the House. It passed the Senate. Newsom wouldn't sign it. So send him in a letter and tell him to sign that bill because all this is basically, so washing machines are a source of the plastic from our clothing to the environment. You put a filter on it, it takes like 80 to 90% of them out. Just like your dryer trap, you empty that out, you throw it away, it keeps it out of the environment. Companies have already invented these things. And we also have a bill in Ontario that's also just sitting. So we also need to bug our politicians. I mean, this gets a little political, but I think he has a connection to the white goods industry, basically, which is washing machines, toasters, appliances. And so they at the moment are fighting it, but at the same time, Procter & Gamble, different companies are making these filters because they know this is coming.
And we'll talk citizen science afterwards, because I think it's a great idea. Any other questions from the audience? What's that? I know, I was looking, I was like, but we're in the middle of a conversation. Anyways, so with that, thanks, Sarah. I want to thank Marianne and Chelsea again for an amazing discussion and terrific talks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just echoing Chris, thanks so much, Chelsea and Marianne. Really fascinating discussion. Truly exemplars of U of T's outstanding scientists who also are taking their science out into the real world and considering the impact, relating it to policy, health outcomes, and real world solutions. So yeah, just tremendously inspiring discussion. Thank you, Chris, for moderating, and thanks everyone for your really outstanding and thoughtful questions. Clearly, everyone here was motivated to come for this interesting and important topic. And I think we can all kind of brainstorm together in a U of T huddle and contribute to the solution. So that's great.